I suspected my wife was planning a divorce the morning I watched her smile at me over coffee while hiding a lawyer's envelope in her purse. By sunset, I had moved every asset she thought she could touch. 3 days later, in a quiet office with glass walls and a walnut conference table, Charlotte Whitfield opened the folder my attorney placed in front of her, and for the first time in 31 years of marriage, my wife had nothing to say. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I did not call her what she had become. I simply sat there in my dark blue suit, my hands folded over my cane, and watched the color drain from her face as she realized the old black man she had been underestimating had already read every page of the game she was trying to play. Across from me, Charlotte looked perfect, as she always did. Pearl earrings. Cream blazer. Soft pink lipstick. That polished expression she wore whenever she wanted people to believe she was the reasonable one in the room. Beside her sat her attorney, a thin man with silver glasses who had spent the first 20 minutes explaining how a peaceful separation would be best for everyone. He spoke as if I were tired. As if I were confused. As if the life I built with cracked hands, long nights, and 40 years of discipline was something I might accidentally hand over just because someone put enough paper in front of me. Charlotte had even patted my wrist when we first sat down. Poor little gesture. Sweet enough for witnesses. Cold enough for me to understand. Marcus, she said, we do not have to make this ugly. I looked at her hand resting on mine and remembered when that same hand used to bring me coffee at job sites outside Atlanta, back when I was laying tile, framing houses, and taking every contract nobody else wanted. Back then, she said she believed in me. Back then, she told me the world would see what I was worth one day. I never imagined that after the world finally did, she would be the one counting it behind my back. Her attorney slid the settlement proposal toward me like a dinner menu. The house in Buckhead. Half of my retirement accounts. A share of Whitfield Properties. Access to the lake house. Monthly support, despite the fact that she had her own savings, her own investments, and a closet full of receipts that could have paid a young couple's mortgage for a year. Charlotte watched me closely, waiting for the fear to show. I think she expected trembling. Confusion. Maybe even sadness. She had been telling people I was not as sharp as I used to be. That I forgot things. That paperwork overwhelmed me now. What she forgot was that I had survived banks that would not return my calls, contractors who tried to cheat me, and men who looked me in the eye and called me lucky after I outworked them for decades. I picked up the proposal, read the first page, and smiled. Then my attorney, Leonard Hayes, placed my folder on the table. Charlotte opened it. One page. Then another. Then another. Her fingers stopped moving. Her attorney leaned closer. The room went quiet enough for me to hear the air conditioner humming above us. The lake house was protected. The company's shares were protected. The properties purchased before our marriage were protected. My mother's trust, the one Charlotte never asked about because she never thought an old woman from Macon could have left anything worth protecting, was sealed tighter than a vault. I looked at my wife, the woman who had been preparing to leave me with a smile and a bill, and said, Charlotte, you planned a divorce. I planned to keep what was mine. 72 hours before that office went silent, I was sitting alone at our kitchen table in Buckhead, stirring cream into coffee that had already gone cold. The house was too large for two people who barely spoke anymore. Sunlight came through the tall windows and landed across the marble island Charlotte insisted we installed during the last renovation, the one she called necessary for resale value even though I had never said a word about selling. I had the Atlanta Journal-Constitution open in front of me, but I had read the same sentence 5 times without knowing what it said. At 68, I had learned that a man does not need proof to feel when peace has left his home. He feels it in the way a door closes. He hears it in footsteps that pause before entering a room. He sees it in a phone turned face down every time he walks by. Charlotte came downstairs at 8:15, dressed too carefully for a casual lunch with a friend. Her white blouse had been pressed flat, her hair was pinned neatly at the back of her neck, and she wore the perfume she normally saved for charity dinners and country club events. She kissed the air near my cheek, not my skin, then reached for her purse on the counter. That was when the envelope slipped halfway out. It was thick, ivory-colored, with a return address from a family law office in Midtown. I saw the name clearly. Whitman, Cole and Avery. Divorce, estate planning, asset division. Charlotte pushed it back inside so quickly that a younger man might have pretended he had not noticed. I was not a younger man. I was old enough to understand that panic often wears perfume. She smiled at me and asked if I had taken my blood pressure medicine. Her voice was soft, almost tender, and that made it worse. For months, she had been using concern like a glove, touching everything that belonged to me while leaving no fingerprints. She asked about passwords because she said emergencies could happen. She asked where I kept the property deeds because she wanted to help organize the files. She suggested a power of attorney because, in her words, couples our age should be practical. Practical. That word had become her favorite hiding place. I watched her fasten her bracelet with steady fingers, and I remembered the woman who once sat beside me in a used pickup truck eating gas station sandwiches while I drove from one job site to another. Back then, she never cared that my boots were dusty or that my hands were rough. She said she admired a man who could build something from nothing. Now she looked around the home that something had bought and spoke as if I were becoming a problem to manage. Before she left, she paused at the doorway and said, "Marcus, we should talk about simplifying things soon." I folded the newspaper and looked up at her. Simplifying what? She smiled again, but it did not reach her eyes. The finances. The properties. Everything. At our age, complicated things can become a burden. Then she walked out, heels clicking across the porch, and drove away in the silver Lexus I bought her for our 30th anniversary. I sat there until the sound of her car disappeared. I did not follow her. I did not search her purse. I did not call her name. I simply stood, walked to the study, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, and took out the old leather folder my mother had given me before she passed. Inside were documents Charlotte had never bothered to read because she had never believed my mother could protect anything worth having. That morning, for the first time in a long while, I felt my hands stop shaking. Not because I was calm, but because I finally understood what kind of storm had been moving through my house. By noon, the house had settled into that polished silence Charlotte loved so much. The cleaning service had come and gone. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil. Every throw pillow sat at the right angle, every framed photograph faced the room like it was still telling the truth. I stood in the study with my mother's folder open on the desk and let the last few months replay in my mind, not as memories, but as evidence. The first sign had been small enough to ignore. Charlotte asked me for the password to the investment account while we were watching the evening news. She said she wanted to check whether a dividend had posted, even though she had never cared about dividends in all our years of marriage. I gave her a careful answer and changed the subject. The next week, she asked where I kept the deed to the lake house. She said she was only curious because her friend Margaret had trouble after her husband passed and nobody could find the paperwork. I remember looking at her then, really looking, and noticing how still she became while waiting for my answer. People who ask innocent questions do not hold their breath. Then came the doctor comments. Not direct accusations, never anything bold enough to challenge. Just soft little remarks dropped at dinner parties and church luncheons, wrapped in concern so nobody could call them cruel. Marcus gets tired more easily now. Marcus forgets where he puts things. Marcus has worked so hard for so long, I worry all these properties are too much for him. She said it with one hand on my shoulder, smiling at friends who nodded with sympathy. I smiled too, because that is what a man of my age learns to do when somebody disrespects him politely in public. But I remembered. I remembered the way she corrected me when I mentioned a rental address, even though I was right. I remembered her asking our bank manager whether spouses could view account histories separately. I remembered the evening she suggested we sell Whitfield properties before the market changed, then looked disappointed when I told her I had no interest in selling the company my name was attached to. It was never one large betrayal at first. It was a line of small ones, each one quiet enough to excuse, each one placed exactly where trust used to be. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway where her Lexus had been parked that morning. The empty space looked cleaner than it should have. I thought of Charlotte sitting across from some attorney in Midtown, probably describing me as difficult, aging, proud, maybe even confused. I could almost hear her voice, calm and wounded, explaining how she only wanted fairness. Fairness was another word people used when they were already holding a knife under the table. I opened the bottom drawer and took out a yellow legal pad. On the first line, I wrote passwords. On the second line, property files. On the third, doctor comments. By the time I reached the 10th line, my hand was steady. The marriage I thought was cracking had not cracked at all. It had been quietly taken apart, screw by screw, while I was still living inside it. The phone rang at 1:23 in the afternoon, just as I finished writing the last item on my yellow legal pad. I almost let it go to voicemail. In those days, every unexpected sound in that house seemed to carry bad news, and I had already had enough for one morning. But when I saw Diane Porter's name on the screen, I picked up. Diane had been my bookkeeper for 18 years before she retired to a quiet little ranch house outside Decatur. She knew my company books better than some men. Knew their own children. She had seen Whitfield properties when it was just me, 2 used trucks, and a rented office with a coffee maker that only worked when it felt like it. Diane was not a woman who called to gossip. She said my name once, then went quiet. That silence told me more than any sentence could have. I asked her if everything was all right. She breathed in slowly and said, "Marcus, I need to talk to you in person. Not at your house. Not over the phone." 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from her in a booth at a small diner on Claremont Road, the kind of place that still served meatloaf on Wednesdays and called every man over 60 sir. Diane had a cup of tea in front of her that she never touched. Her hands rested flat on the table, but I could see the tension in her fingers. She looked older than the last time I saw her, but her eyes were still sharp. She opened her purse and took out a folded sheet of paper. I did not reach for it right away. I waited. She said Charlotte had called her twice in the past month. The first time, my wife said she was helping me organize financial records for estate planning. The second time, she became more specific. She wanted old purchase dates. Property values. Company structure. Whether certain assets had been bought before or after our wedding. Whether Diane had copies of anything tied to my mother's estate. At that, I felt something cold move through me, but I kept my face still. Diane looked down and said there was something else. Charlotte had asked, very carefully, whether I had ever made mistakes in the company books. Whether I forgot meetings. Whether employees had noticed any confusion. Diane said it kindly, but kindness did not soften the meaning. My wife was not only gathering numbers. She was gathering a story. A version of me that looked weaker than I was. A version that could be placed in front of a judge, an attorney, or anyone willing to believe age had made me careless. I looked out the diner window at traffic moving along the road, ordinary people going ordinary places, and I wondered how many of them were sitting across from someone at breakfast without knowing they were. Already being measured for loss. Diane slid the paper toward me. It was a list of the questions Charlotte had asked, written in Diane's careful handwriting. I folded it once and placed it inside my coat pocket. Then I asked her the only question that mattered. Did Charlotte ask about the trust by name? Diane shook her head. No, she said. She asked if your mother left anything that could complicate a divorce. I almost smiled then, but not because anything was funny. My mother, Loretta Whitfield, had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who mistook quiet for empty. She had cleaned offices at night, saved every spare dollar, bought land when nobody around her thought it mattered, and left instructions so precise that even grief could not blur them. Charlotte had spent 31 years enjoying the shade of a tree she never cared to study. Now she was standing under its branches with a saw made of assumptions. I thanked Diane, paid for both cups of tea, and walked back to my truck with the first real piece of proof resting against my chest. I did not drive home right away. I sat in my truck outside the diner with both hands on the steering wheel, watching people come and go with takeout bags, work uniforms, grocery lists, and ordinary worries. For a few minutes, I envied them. Ordinary trouble has a shape you can understand. A flat tire. A late bill. A doctor appointment. Betrayal is different. Betrayal walks through your kitchen wearing perfume, asks about your medicine, and hides a family law envelope in a purse you bought for Christmas. I started the engine and drove south instead of north, away from Buckhead, past the neighborhoods where the lawns grew wider and the houses grew quieter, until the city thinned out and the roads began to look familiar in an older way. I ended up near the first duplex I ever bought, a brick place with white trim on a modest street outside East Point. The paint was newer now, and the maple tree in the yard had grown tall enough to shade the upstairs windows, but I still remembered the night I signed the papers. I was 32 years old, wearing my only good jacket, sitting across from a loan officer who kept calling me lucky as if luck had poured concrete, patched roofs, balanced ledgers, and worked Saturdays for 10 straight years. Charlotte had been beside me that day. She held my hand under the table when the man asked whether I understood the repayment terms. I did understand. I understood every line. I understood interest, risk, taxes, repairs, vacancy, and every small humiliation that came with being a black man asking to be taken seriously in rooms built to doubt him. When we walked out, Charlotte kissed my cheek in the parking lot and said, "One day they will beg to do business with you." I believed her. Maybe that was why this hurt so deeply. She had seen how hard I fought to build a name no one could laugh off. She had watched me come home with dust in my hair and swelling in my knees. She had watched me skip vacations so I could make payroll. She had watched my mother sit at our kitchen table with a calculator, teaching me to keep receipts because memory was not protection, paper was. Loretta Whitfield never trusted pretty words when money was involved. She used to say, "A promise is only as strong as the person who loses something by breaking it." I used to think that sounded cold. Now, sitting outside that old duplex with Diane's note in my coat pocket, I understood it was not cold at all. It was mercy wearing work clothes. I thought about Charlotte's recent dinner parties, the way she laughed with women who spoke about second chapters as if husbands were starter homes. I thought about her stepson, Evan, leaning against my kitchen counter 2 weeks earlier, telling me that his mother deserved comfort after all these years, as though comfort had not been wrapped around her in silk, marble, and imported tile. He had looked at my house like a man measuring curtains before the owner had moved out. At the time, I told myself I was being sensitive. That is another thing age can do to a decent man. It can make him question his own instincts because he does not want to become bitter. But there is a difference between bitterness and recognition. Bitterness invents enemies. Recognition finally names them. I drove past the duplex twice, slow enough to see the tenants. Bicycles on the porch and a child's chalk drawing on the sidewalk. That little building had helped pay for our first real home. Then the next property. Then the company office. Then the lake house everyone admired but nobody asked how I protected. Charlotte had not married a careless man. She had simply grown comfortable believing love would make me careless. By the time I turned back toward Atlanta, the afternoon sun was low and gold across the windshield. I was not thinking about revenge. Revenge is noisy. Revenge wants applause. What I wanted was cleaner than that. I wanted the truth written in a form no one could soften, twist, or smile away. I wanted every deed, every trust document, every account record, every dated note placed in order. I wanted Charlotte to sit in a room full of paper and finally understand that my silence had never been surrender. It had been storage. Leonard Hayes still kept his office on Auburn Avenue, above a pharmacy that had been there longer than half the banks in Atlanta. He was 74, walked with a silver-handled cane, and wore bow ties that made younger attorneys underestimate him until he opened his mouth. I had known Leonard since I was a young man with more ambition than cash, back when I needed somebody to explain incorporation papers without talking down to me. He had helped me form Whitfield Properties, reviewed my first commercial lease, and later sat with my mother at her kitchen table in Macon while she decided exactly how her land, savings, and mineral rights would be protected after she was gone. When I walked into his office that afternoon with my mother's leather folder under one arm and Diane Porter's note in my coat pocket, Leonard looked over his glasses and said, "I was wondering when you were going to come see me." I did not ask how he knew. Men like Leonard did not guess. They observed. His office smelled like old paper, coffee, and furniture polish. On the wall behind him were framed photographs of civil rights leaders, judges, church picnics, and a younger version of himself standing beside my mother, both of them serious enough to scare a dishonest man straight. I sat across from him and placed everything on his desk. The trust documents. The purchase records. The company bylaws. The insurance policies. The property files I had kept in order because my mother had trained me to respect paper more than memory. Leonard worked slowly. He read each page with a yellow pencil in his hand, making marks in the margins, asking quiet questions that sounded simple until they opened whole rooms of meaning. Was Charlotte present when this property was purchased? Did joint funds maintain it? Did she ever sign this operating agreement? Did anyone outside the trust receive distributions? Did she have authorized access to this account? I answered each one carefully. No guessing. No anger. Just facts. That was what Leonard wanted. Facts do not tremble when feelings walk into the room. After nearly an hour, he leaned back and folded his hands over his vest. "Marcus," he said, "she can ask for many things. But asking does not mean owning." I felt the sentence settle into me like a chair finally holding my weight. He explained what I already suspected but needed to hear from the mouth of a man who had spent a lifetime reading traps before people stepped into them. The lake house was held by my mother's trust. The first rental properties were purchased before my marriage to Charlotte and documented cleanly. The company had ownership restrictions that prevented any spouse from simply reaching in and taking control. Certain accounts were separate property, funded before marriage or through inheritance. The assets Charlotte thought were sitting loose on a table were not loose at all. They were locked behind dates, signatures, clauses, and the kind of discipline she had mistaken for old-fashioned stubbornness. Then Leonard's face hardened. He read Diane's note twice. "This part matters," he said. "If she is trying to build a claim that you lack capacity, we answer before she speaks too loudly." That evening, we began moving with care. Not hiding. Not stealing. Not touching anything that belonged to the marriage unfairly. We clarified ownership. We notified banks that no unauthorized requests should be honored. We removed Charlotte's informal access where she had no legal right to be. We updated contact information, secured digital records, and scheduled a medical evaluation to document what Charlotte had been trying to question. Every step was lawful. Every step was quiet. By the time I left Leonard's office, Atlanta traffic was crawling under a purple sky, and my phone showed 3 missed calls from Charlotte. I did not call her back. For the first time in months, I was not afraid of what she knew. I was only wondering how long it would take her to realize what she did not know. Charlotte did not ask where I had been when I came home that night. She was standing in the living room beside the fireplace, holding her phone with both hands, her face arranged into calmness the way some people arrange flowers before company arrives. There were candles burning on the mantel, the expensive kind she bought from a boutique in Buckhead, and a bottle of wine open on the sideboard. For a moment, if a stranger had walked in, they might have thought we were a peaceful older couple preparing for a quiet dinner. But peace has a sound, and that room did not have it. Charlotte looked up and smiled. "There you are," she said. I was beginning to worry. I took off my coat and hung it in the hall closet. Worry had become another tool in her hands, like concern, like practical, like fairness. I told her traffic was slow, which was true enough to stand on. She said Evan was coming by for dinner. She said it casually, but I noticed the second place setting beside hers and the way the good wine had been opened before I arrived. Evan was Charlotte's son from her first marriage, 42 years old, a man who spoke about business as if repeating words he heard in airport lounges. He had never worked for Whitfield Properties, never missed a weekend to repair a leaking roof, never sat across from a lender who acted as if your skin made your numbers less real. But lately, he had developed strong opinions about what his mother deserved. He arrived 20 minutes later wearing a navy sport coat and that confident smile people wear when they believe the hard part has already been handled by someone else. During dinner, Charlotte served salmon, roasted asparagus, and wild rice. Food she made when she wanted the evening to look civilized. Evan asked about my health before he asked about the company. Then he asked about the company anyway. He said, "Marcus, have you thought more about stepping back? At your age, peace of mind is worth more than control." I cut a piece of salmon and chewed slowly. Charlotte lowered her eyes to her plate, but I saw her listening. Evan went on, saying his mother had spent 3 decades supporting my dreams, and it was only right that she be comfortable if things changed. Things. He said it softly, but the words sat on the table like a sealed envelope. I looked at him and asked what things he meant. Charlotte touched her napkin to her lips. Evan smiled too quickly. "Life," he said. "Retirement. Transitions." I nodded as if I respected the performance. Then Charlotte reached across the table and placed her hand near mine, not touching this time. She said she wanted us to meet with her attorney the next morning, only to discuss options, only to keep everything respectful. There it was. The invitation dressed as concern. The decision already made, wrapped in courtesy, offered to me like a seat in my own funeral procession. I looked from Charlotte to Evan and saw what they had been imagining. The house divided. The company valued. The lake house claimed. The old man guided gently into surrender while everyone praised themselves for being kind. I almost felt sorry for how certain they were. After dinner, Evan walked through my living room with his wineglass, studying the built-in shelves, the art, the piano Charlotte never played. He paused near the window overlooking the back garden and said, "This place has appreciated beautifully." Charlotte gave him a look, quick and sharp, but I caught it. A house can hear when people are already selling it in their minds. I stood, collected the plates, and carried them to the kitchen. Charlotte followed me, her heels quiet against the tile. She asked if I was upset. I rinsed a plate under warm water and told her no. She asked if I would come to the attorney's office. I dried my hands, turned to face her, and said I would be there at 10. Relief crossed her face so fast she could not hide it. She thought I had agreed to step into her plan. She did not know Leonard Hayes had already confirmed the bank notices. She did not know the trust documents were copied, organized, and waiting in a brown leather folder. She did not know Diane Porter's handwritten notes were sealed in my attorney's file. She did not know that my medical evaluation was scheduled, my accounts were secured, and every door she expected to open had already been checked from the other side. That night, Charlotte slept in the guest room, claiming she had a headache. I sat in the study beneath the old brass lamp, listening to the quiet house breathe around me. On my desk was a photograph from our 10th anniversary, taken before money made some people forget the cost of loyalty. I looked at my younger face in the frame, then at Charlotte's smile beside me. For a moment, I let myself grieve the woman I once believed she was. Then I placed the photograph face down, closed my mother's leather folder, and set my alarm for 7. The next morning, Charlotte was already dressed when I came downstairs. She wore a gray dress, pearl earrings, and the calm expression of a woman who believed the room ahead of her had been prepared in her favor. Her coffee sat untouched on the counter. Mine was not poured. Small things tell the truth before people do. She asked if I wanted to ride with her to the attorney's office. I told her I would drive myself. For the first time that morning, her smile slipped. Only for a second, but I saw it. Control is easy to recognize when someone loses even an inch of it. I arrived 10 minutes early at the glass building in Midtown, where the lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive flowers. Charlotte was already there with Evan, though he was not supposed to be part of the meeting. He stood when I walked in, smoothing his jacket as if preparing to manage me. Charlotte touched his arm and whispered something. I nodded to them both and sat across the lobby without conversation. At exactly 10, Leonard Hayes stepped out of the elevator beside me, wearing a charcoal suit, a burgundy bow tie, and the same quiet face he wore when banks used to assume he was not the most dangerous reader of contracts in the room. Charlotte stared at him, then looked at me. You brought an attorney, she said. I looked at her evenly. You invited me to one. Her mouth closed. That was the first silence of the day. The conference room had a long walnut table, a wall of windows, and a view of traffic moving slowly along Peachtree Street. Charlotte's attorney, Mr. Avery, greeted everyone with professional warmth. He offered coffee. Leonard declined. I declined. Charlotte accepted water but never took a sip. Mr. Avery began gently, explaining that Charlotte wanted a respectful separation, a fair division, and a process that protected dignity on both sides. He said dignity as though it had not already been handled carelessly before I entered the room. Then he slid a settlement proposal across the table. The language was smooth. The meaning was not. Charlotte wanted the Buckhead house sold or awarded to her with compensation from my accounts. She wanted access to the lake house for 6 months each year. She wanted a portion of Whitfield properties valued as a marital asset. She wanted monthly support at a level that made Leonard raise one eyebrow and nothing else. She also wanted temporary control of certain shared financial records, citing concern that I might become overwhelmed by complex decisions. There it was in clean black ink. The story she had been building. The old husband. The worried wife. The gentle transfer of power. I read slowly, page by page, while Charlotte watched me with practiced sadness. Evan sat against the wall, pretending not to listen while listening to every breath. When I finished, I placed the packet on the table and folded my hands. Mr. Avery asked if I understood the proposal. I said I understood it very well. Charlotte leaned toward me, softening her voice. Marcus, this does not have to be difficult. We are both older now. I just want security. I looked at the woman who had spent months confusing security with possession. Then I turned to Leonard. He opened his leather briefcase and removed a brown folder. Not thick. Not dramatic. Just enough paper to change the temperature in the room. He placed the first document in front of Mr. Avery. The Lake House Trust. Then the purchase records for the first rental properties. Then the operating agreement for Whitfield properties. Then the inheritance documents from my mother. Then Diane Porter's dated notes. Then copies of the requests Charlotte had made through back channels, all carefully documented. Mr. Avery stopped smiling on the 3rd page. By the 5th, he was reading twice. By the 7th, he had taken off his glasses and set them on the table. Charlotte reached for the documents, but her hand paused above them as if the paper itself had become hot. Leonard spoke calmly. The lake house is not subject to division in the manner proposed. Certain properties predate the marriage and are separately documented. Company control cannot be transferred under this agreement. Informal access to Mr. Whitfield's separate accounts has been revoked. Any claim concerning capacity should be made carefully, because we are prepared to answer it fully. The room went still. Charlotte looked at me then, not with sadness, not with concern, but with the bare face people show when the mask becomes too heavy to hold. Her lips parted, but no words came. Evan shifted in his chair. Mr. Avery looked down at his papers, suddenly very interested in the fine print. I did not feel joy. Joy would have been too simple. What I felt was the clean, hard edge of truth finally sitting in the open. For 31 years, Charlotte thought my silence meant I did not see. That morning, in front of her attorney, she learned that silence can also mean preparation. Charlotte found her voice after nearly a full minute, but it was not the voice she had used at dinner or in the lobby or over all those careful months when she called suspicion concern. It came out thin and sharp around the edges. She said I had humiliated her. I looked at the papers on the table, then at the woman across from me, and wondered how strange it was that people could plan your undoing in private and still call it humiliation when you refused to cooperate. Leonard did not respond to her emotion. He only asked Mr. Avery whether his client wished to revise the proposal in light of the documentation. Mr. Avery cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and said they would need time to review the materials. Evan stood so quickly his chair made a hard sound against the carpet. He said this was not fair to his mother. That word again. Fair. I turned to him for the first time that morning and said, Evan, fair is knowing what a man owns before you start dividing it in your head. He looked away first. Charlotte stared at me as if I had become someone unfamiliar, but the truth was I had never been unfamiliar. She had simply stopped looking. The meeting ended without signatures, without raised voices, without the scene she could later describe as my temper. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and thanked Mr. Avery for his time. Charlotte followed me into the hallway, her heels clicking faster than before. Marcus, she said, you cannot just shut me out of everything. I stopped beside the elevator. I did not look at Leonard. I did not need help answering that. I told her I had not shut her out of everything. I had shut her out of what was never hers to take. Her face changed again, and for one brief second, I saw less anger than fear. Not fear of me. Fear of losing the story she had been telling herself. The story where she was the patient wife, the reasonable woman, the one who deserved to be carried into comfort because she had stood near the work long enough to call it hers. I drove home alone. The house looked different when I walked in, not smaller, not colder, just honest. The marble island was still there. The staircase still curved toward the second floor. The framed anniversary photograph still lay face down on my desk. But the home no longer felt like a place where I had to pretend. Charlotte came back 2 hours later and went straight upstairs. I heard drawers open, then close. I heard her talking quietly on the phone behind the guest room door. I made myself a sandwich, sat at the kitchen table, and ate slowly while the evening settled over Atlanta. For the first time in months, no one asked me where a deed was. No one asked for a password. No one told me complicated things were too much for a man my age. The divorce did not end that day. Nothing legal ends that cleanly. There were more meetings, more revised proposals, more polite letters filled with cold intentions. But the balance had shifted. Charlotte could still leave. She could still ask. She could still be angry. What she could not do anymore was walk into a room and expect my life to be waiting there unguarded. Weeks later, I moved into the lake house full-time, not because I had to, but because quiet had started to feel like medicine. It sat 2 hours from Atlanta, tucked behind pine trees, with a wooden porch facing water that turned silver in the morning. I brought my mother's leather folder with me and placed it in a fireproof safe beside the deed, the trust papers, and the photograph. I finally turned face up again. I did not hate Charlotte. Hatred keeps a person living in the same room as the betrayal. I wanted distance. I wanted coffee at sunrise, my old pickup in the gravel drive, and evenings where my phone could ring without making my chest tighten. I had spent 31 years believing love meant sharing everything. At 68, I learned that love without respect is not sharing. It is access waiting to become entitlement. In the end, I did not lose my marriage in that attorney's office. I lost the illusion that loyalty could be measured by years alone. Some people stay beside you for decades and still never learn the weight of what you built. Some people mistake patience for weakness until the day patience arrives with records, signatures, witnesses, and a calm old man who finally knows his own worth.